Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This time tomorrow night, he'll have started his final negotiations with other European leaders in Brussels to reach a deal. Today, though, David Cameron has spent his time holed up at number 10, trying to shore up last-minute support. If the Prime Minister does get agreement over benefit curbs for migrant workers and other reforms, the UK could vote on EU membership this summer. If he doesn't, well, what then? While there was support today from Germany and Italy, the man chairing the talks warned there was no guarantee a deal could be reached. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
David Cameron im Namen Großbritanniens.
Three of Europe's biggest powers weighed in ahead of tomorrow's summit, saying Britain's demands were reasonable and Europe needed a deal. Chancellor Merkel told the German parliament Britain's demands were justifiable. I am convinced that it is in our national interest for Britain to remain an active part of a strong and successful European Union. The Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi told Italy's parliament we must make every possible effort to keep Britain in the EU. The French Prime Minister Manuel Valls warned the French Parliament the departure of Britain would signify a shock for Europe, but more importantly, a shock to the way the world sees a Europe which is already in crisis. Worries like that will be at the front of minds when these leaders meet again tomorrow. They'll have to balance that with long-held suspicions about the British negotiation. Belgium's concerned about a risk of contagion that other countries could try to rule out ever closer union, just like the UK. French negotiators have been keen to ensure there's no revision of past treaties. They're also worried that David Cameron's reforms don't let banks in the city wriggle out of euro banking rules. The four Eastern European countries, known as the Visegrad Four, have insisted that cuts to child benefits for EU workers in Britain whose children live over the Channel only applies to new arrivals. Spain and Portugal are unhappy with much of the deal, but Spain's between governments, so won't have its normal weight. Portugal's Prime Minister only got the job last month and may be under pressure not to throw his weight about. The man who'll chair the summit starting tomorrow, former Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, tonight wrote to EU leaders saying there will not be a better time for a compromise, though there is still no guarantee that we will reach agreement.
You kept us waiting for a while. Are you going to make up your mind today, do you think?
Not long to get. You got to summit tomorrow, mate. Oh, it's not.
With an eye on the campaign that would follow agreement, the Prime Minister called the Mayor of London into number 10 today for a chat. Mr Cameron outlined plans which Mr Johnson's been lobbying for to assert Parliament's laws over EU law. Boris Johnson, as he left, was still not saying which way he'd jump.
Is the deal good enough?
I'll be back.
I'll be back.
No deal. Sorry about that.
While they met, official figures came out reporting the number of Romanians and Bulgarians now working in the UK reached a record 200,000 last year. The total number of EU nationals working here reached just over 2 million. It looks like none of them will be affected by David Cameron's changes to in-work benefits. Newcomers only. Number 10 is still fighting to get child benefit cut for the 30,000 or so who are working here but sending child benefit back to their children on the continent.
The child benefit case there is an example of the sort of negotiating tactics we get into tomorrow. The government's keeping it there as a demand. It wants retrospectively to clip the child benefit of EU workers who are in this country sending money across the Channel. But it isn't really convinced it's going to get that. Other countries have really been digging in their heels. It's still on the table because the government, and this is the way negotiations work, hopes it can get something better than it might as a second option. It might get an even earlier sort of crackdown after the referendum date, an earlier crackdown than it might have got, if it keeps on pushing for this probably now unrealistic demand. That's the sort of stuff we're in for over the next 2 days.
Well, brinkmanship is Europe's stock in trade. I mean, nevertheless, is a deal going to be reached?
I think there's a serious possibility it is. There might be a concern about EU migration here, but in just about every other country represented at the EU summit, there is a concern about non-EU migration something of crisis proportions that voters are beating down the Prime Minister's doors to talk about. And they want to get on to that, really. And they also don't want another crisis in Europe, as you heard the French Prime Minister talking about there. Britain leaving, voting to leave, feeling it hasn't got a good enough deal. That is something the EU really doesn't want to see after the Eurozone crisis, in the middle of what is becoming known as the Schengen crisis. One other thing, though, that you can never anticipate with these summits, David Cameron rushed off to Paris at the beginning of this week because the talks with officials were getting a little bit brittle. Once he got into the room with President Hollande in the Elysee, things were a little bit smoother. They slightly wondered why they'd made the journey. It can go the other way. There could have been chats with officials that have been going reasonably well from a certain country. David Cameron gets in the room tomorrow and suddenly it feels like the guy representing the other country has got shoes on that are too tight. You just can't anticipate that. But at the moment, it looks as though we will have a deal at some point on Friday. Can't be sure whether it'll be in time for this cabinet. Can't really be sure of anything.
Thank you very much, Gary.